Okay, good evening and welcome to my conversation on electric boat conversions. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties, but this is the first time I've done a real live stream and I had a little trouble getting it started. So hopefully you guys will be able to find this and it will make a little sense to you. So before I start, I have to let you know that I'm not an electrician. I'm certainly not selling any electric boat parts, and I'm not actually promoting any particular company. The whole point of this chat is just to let you guys know my experiences with electric boats. I had a 41-foot Formosa ketch that in 2008 I bought, and it had a dodgy motor. I had every intention of replacing the motor, and I used the dodgy motor as a good buyer's pitch to reduce the price of the boat, knowing full well that I was going to reduce the cost of the boat because of the motor. During the refit of the boat, I took the motor out and threw it away, and then I looked for some different options on what I could do to repower the boat. I looked at first a rebuilt Perkins 4108, which was going to work out to be about $15,000. And then I decided that because a new motor in a 35-year-old boat, I would replace all of the extra gear that goes alongside the motor rather than try and mate it up to old equipment. So that boosted the cost, in estimate only, to around $20,000. Then I decided, okay, if I didn't want a rebuilt motor, what would I go for? And I looked at the beta diesels. This would have been a little underpowered. The Perkins motor was, where are we? The Perkins motor was about 45 horsepower, and the beta diesel was around 30 horsepower, 28 horsepower, I believe. It was a fairly reasonable price. I was going to get out of that for purchasing the motor and installing bits and pieces for around $30,000 was my best estimate. There are a whole bunch of things that needed to be changed because it was a different type of motor fitting into a boat that had a previous motor that wasn't the same. When I looked at that, I thought $30,000, it's a fair chunk of change, and then I'd have a boat with an underpowered motor. So then I decided to look again, and I looked at a slightly overpowered motor. And what I looked at was the Cummins 65. The biggest problem I had with the Cummins 65, except for the price, which was around $35,000 for the motor, plus all the extra pieces I would have had to put into the boat to make the Cummins work, I was looking at around $40,000 to repower with a Cummins diesel. The biggest problem I had with that, however, unfortunately, above the price, was the engine box inside the cabin would have needed a rebuild, redesign, because the motor was about, I would have had to add 2 inches on either side of the motor, which meant the entire engine box would have had to be replaced. Hi, Paolo. Nice to see you here. So then I was looking at alternatives. I didn't really want to redesign the boat to fit a motor. I wanted a motor that would fit in the boat. So then what I was looking for was alternatives. And then I came across the San Francisco Boat Show in 2009. And I was walking around having a look at all the bits and pieces for boats. And what I came across was the electric yacht stall. And they had quite a simple setup. It was a fish tank with a prop shaft and a small propeller. And they had a little electric motor with some batteries, and they were encouraging people to come and play with the controller. So I was standing there looking at that for quite some time, and I was just simply amazed. It was push forward, pull back, go back. It was completely silent, and the power was instantaneous. And I was quite mesmerized by that. And it got me started thinking, well, why not go alternative power? Being my first boat, for the first time I was the skipper of a boat, and I decided that I would try for something a little bit different. Can you hear me, Paolo? Can you give me a thumbs up if the sound is okay? I have no idea if you guys can hear me or not, so I'm just hoping you can. So I looked at electric motors. I stood there for a while, and there was a whole bunch of people standing there watching. And eventually, the crowd started to disperse. So I went up to the salesman and I spoke to him briefly. And I said to him, I'm very interested in this electric motor business. Can you tell me about it? And first question he asked me was what kind of boat you had. I told him it was a 41 Formosa catch, and he kind of looked a bit confused. I showed him some photos, and he informed me that they'd never done a boat that size before. So I was a little bit disappointed, let's say. However, I didn't give up. I asked them if it would be eventually possible to do an electric boat on that size, and they agreed that eventually they would, and if I was serious, they'd go back and look into it. So I told them I was serious. I'd sign a check there and then if they could give me the equipment I was needing. And off they went, and I took off home and went back to the boat and decided to strip everything out of the boat that was motor related. I intended to replace it all anyway. And I went home, I cleaned out the motor, I took it out, I threw it away. I didn't give it to anybody, I didn't sell it to anybody. I decided if I'm going to go electric and I'm going to go green, why put a stinky old diesel that needed rebuilding back into the system anyway? So that's being used as landfill somewhere, I guess. I could have got rid of it a little bit more environmentally friendly, but I just wanted it out of there. I then cleaned the bilge. I took out everything from inside the bilge. I pressure washed it. I steam cleaned it. I chemically cleaned it. I scrubbed it. I polished it. And I took out all of the old oil that had been sloshing around in the bilge and completely repainted the bilge, which was honestly the best thing I did when I converted the boat, because I removed all old smells out of the boat and I had a bilge that was almost brand new again. From a brand new bilge, I could reinstall bilge pumps in the way I wanted them. I contacted the electric yacht company again, and they still hadn't done anything towards building a bigger system. So I put that on hold, and I did the rest of my conversion. I redid the sails, I redid the rigging, I redid the decks, I did a whole bunch of changing about. I built a hard dodger on the back of the boat. I redid the decks with fake teak, and I spent 6 months wondering what was going to happen. While I was surfing the net, I found that there were other boat companies, other electric companies that were doing boats. I went to Thusa, but unfortunately Thusa didn't answer my phone calls for 6 months. They didn't answer my emails, and I got sick of waiting. There was a boat in Australia, another 41 Formosa type boat that was converting, and the guy had put a Thusa in it, but unfortunately he had an accident falling off his rig when he was up on top doing something and hurt himself quite badly, so his project was on hold. Then there popped up a lawyer from Los Angeles, Scott, if you're out there somewhere, thanks man. And he told me about his electric yacht conversion project. And he had the boat, he took the motor out, but he'd never actually put the system in. An electric yacht had supplied the system. They sent it to him and it was sitting on pallets in his driveway. So I jumped straight in my truck. I drove down to Los Angeles and I encouraged him on the weekend to go down and together we could put this thing in, which we did. It was very easy to do. The installation was quite simple. On his boat, it was a little messy. I think he might have wanted to take a little more time preparing, but he wasn't really interested in that at the time. But come Sunday afternoon, we turned the key, we pushed the throttle forward, and lo and behold, the motor started spinning, the propeller started spinning, and the boat lunged forward onto the mooring lines, which was kind of fantastic. I was completely addicted from that point on. So I jumped on the phone again. I called Scott from Electric Yacht. And I said, hey, Scott, I just saw Scott in Los Angeles system, and I want one. I want one exactly the same. Can you hook me up? We talked about price, and we came up about, well, we'll get to the price in a bit. But we had a good conversation, and I decided that I was going to do it there and then. And I sent him a $10,000 check that week to let him know I was serious and to have him start to build the system. While he was building the system, we had a bit of a conversation, and 48 volts is the normal. I was also looking at 72-volt system, but unfortunately, while I was doing my research, I couldn't find any marine grade parts that were 72 volts, which is something to take into consideration, because if you do need spares, then everything you need has to be available reasonably simply. Otherwise, you're going to be stuck in a marine chandler store waiting on pieces that don't actually exist, and then it becomes quite expensive to build them. So I settled on a 48-volt system, and then we talked about batteries. And I won't go into the different types of batteries or the pros and cons of said batteries. However, the lead acid batteries, although cheaper, were not something I was really interested in. A, the weight, and B, the charging of them. If you leave them run down too long, then they're never going to come all the way fully back. I looked at gel batteries, and again, very heavy, reasonably expensive. But again, with the charging of them, you have to top them up again as soon as you use them, because if you leave them low for any amount of time, then you're going to have problems getting them to come back fully charged. So then I looked at lithium-ion batteries, and although very expensive, it turns out lithium-ion batteries don't mind being left run down. You can come back and charge them later, and they will come back. They also have a much better discharge curve. Although lithium-ion batteries, as soon as you turn them on, seem to drop a little, then there's a long flat spot while they're draining, and then they just drop off and they're dead. The wet batteries, the regular batteries, will actually discharge all the way down, and towards the bottom end you'll still get the power, but the power starts to taper off and then they're dead. Very similar with gel batteries. I like the fact that with the lithium-ion batteries you have the long flat spot in the middle. It's a bit unusual and confusing when you start out. However, what was important to me, because I was going to be a cruising boat and not a dock queen, I wasn't just going to be a day sailor. I was taking my boat to Mexico, and I was going to live on my boat. My boat was not going to be in marinas. It was going to be either out sailing, or it was going to be at anchor. So I wanted something that if I couldn't charge them up immediately, it wasn't going to do any damage to the batteries. So I decided on the lithium-ion batteries. Now on my batteries, range anxiety is always the big thing with electric, and we'll get further into range anxiety later and how to overcome it. But initially, without very many people having done this before me, I had no idea what I wanted these batteries to do. So instead of going small, and then if that wasn't enough, adding to it, I was intending to go to Mexico fairly quickly, so I decided to go as high as I could afford to go, with as many batteries as early as I can. And in hindsight, I think that was a little bit of a mistake. Although I had extra power and I had extra range, I never really used it. And because it was an electric boat, I never really needed it. Again, we'll go into that in a little further. There's some questions you guys asked me that I'd like to answer, and those questions will be answered then. So a little bit of the specs on the boat I had. It was a 41 Formosa. It was 41 feet long. The length of the waterline was 32 feet. It was 12-foot beam, and it had a 6-foot draft. It was a full keel, full displacement boat. Again, there's very few full keel boats that had been made electric before, and there was a lot of people detracting, saying it will never work, it will never work, you don't have the power. It had 28,000 pound displacement, 9,200 pounds of steel in the keel, and as I said earlier, it was a Perkins 4108 diesel, 45 horsepowers. My experience was as a Royal Navy engineer in the Royal Australian Navy, working on diesel engines and steam engines. I had no idea about electric engines. I had, however, worked on many kinds of ships and boats and cruisers and dive boats and all kinds of things out of the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. And so I did have some idea of what boats were. Unfortunately, none of those boats were my boats. They were always owned by somebody else. So I was always doing what they wanted me to do on their boat. This was, like I said earlier, my first boat. I was the boss. I'm the captain. I get to make the decisions. And no matter how much people were telling me it was not a good idea, I decided that's what I wanted to do. And once I made that decision, I'd stuck to it. Now, like I say, my engine was shot to crap. It was leaking oil. It was all choked up. It had way less than 45 horsepower. It was noisy. It was stinky. You know the story with diesel boats. There's not much more I can tell you about that. So finally, Scott told me, hey, dude, your motors are ready. Your batteries are here. It took 6 months waiting for them to get to the States from China. This was back in 2010. Back in 2010, there was very high demand for lithium-ion batteries, and mine being a reasonably big order, although a really small order on the big picture of things, it didn't seem like anybody was prioritizing it. So after a few phone calls with Scott jumping up and down, yelling and screaming, I'd already paid for the entire system by then, and I was still just sitting there on the hard, waiting for it. It was quite depressing. But after a while, he jumped on the phone to China. China pulled their finger out of their bum, and eventually mine arrived. So it arrived. I had stainless steel rails put in the bilge for the engine mounts. They're all pre-drilled. All the technical specs were worked out by much smarter people than me. Scott McMillan from Electric Boats was a big help with that. I also went to Acme Props, and I spoke to them. I originally wanted a folding prop put in my boat to try and get rid of some of the drag, and the cutout on my rudder wouldn't allow for a folding prop. So then after speaking to Scott McMillan and Acme Props, it was actually pointed out to me that regeneration was possible. So rather than go for a folding prop and get rid of any drag, any extra drag, what we decided was I was actually going to get an oversized prop, and the blades on my prop were huge. The prop was custom made, and it was custom made with the idea of a lot of drag and being able to spin backwards in mind, to catch as much of the drag as possible to allow for maximum regeneration. Now, luckily for me, 41 Formosa is a big, heavy, full keel displacement boat. When you're sailing along, you throw a bucket over the back tied to a rope, it's not actually going to slow your boat down that much. Whereas if you've got a fin keel or something that's a little bit less underwater, any drag hanging off the back doesn't affect its performance. But I was looking for regeneration, so we had a prop made that was quite big for the boat. And not only did it give me extra thrust going forward, it also gave me extra regeneration power when the boat was sailing along. It would catch the drag, the prop would spin, and I could catch regeneration. So the new prop went on. The prop shaft was 1 5/8 inches, I think it was, on the Formosa. It was quite large. We decided to come down to 1 1/4 inches. I'd already decided to replace everything on the running gear for the boat, so a new prop shaft wasn't that much, and so we had 1 1/4 inch prop shaft put in, which meant a new thing out the back of the boat. I forget the name right now, which was easy enough. We got the old one out, cut that out, and put the new memory's gone. The little bit that goes in the back of the boat before the prop shaft comes out, that one. It was a morning's work. We froze it to shrink it. We pushed it in. It warms up and it swells up and it seals it. I also decided to put a PPK dripless prop shaft seal in. I decided that I was going to try and have a dry bilge. Not that that's ever really possible on a boat, but there's no point having a dripping seal in the back if I got electric motors and batteries. The battery box, I was very lucky. The fuel tank for my Formosa was under the main cabin floor, right in the center of the boat. And it was a, where are we? A 60-gallon tank, 227 liters. It was right down low in the boat, as low as you can get in the boat. So the center of gravity was great down there. And after doing a little bit of measuring, it turns out my entire battery bank would fit down at the lowest point of my bilge, or under my floor at least, in the highest point of my bilge. So water getting into it wasn't going to be a problem. And I fiberglassed up a nice big battery box, and I put a 1/2-inch Lexan clear plastic lid on it, so that once I lift the deck plates on my cabin sole, I could just do visual inspections inside the battery box to see if any water or anything else was in there. When my kit arrived from Electric Yacht, I was stoked. My boat was ready. All I had to do was get down to the dockyard and install it. That's where the fun started. Everything was marked for me. I had wiring looms. I had battery boxes, packs of 8 3.5 volt, 180 amp hour batteries. There were 6 packs of those. Each one weighed approximately 100 pounds. So that was 600 pounds I was putting down deep in my bottom of my boat on the center line. And I was getting rid of, I have some numbers here. Boom, 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 boom. Where are we? I was getting rid of 450 pounds of fuel. That's a 220 liter fuel tank, with the stainless steel tank as well, was running at about 450 pounds. The Perkins diesel was 450 pounds. So that was about 900 pounds altogether. And there was about 250, 300 pounds of other gear on the boat that I'd got rid of. So I was down around 1,200, 1,300 pounds off the boat. The Perkins diesel in the boat sit slightly to port, a few degrees off centerline. So getting rid of the diesel, getting rid of the engine, the tank, and getting rid of all the gear that goes alongside the tank, I was actually quite light. The motors themselves, I had the holes already pre-drilled. All I had to do was bolt those in, install the battery packs, run the wiring looms, connect it all up, and then run the throttle cable from the battery, from the helm and the aft deck through the bilge to the motors. Now, that entire installation took me less than a day. Unfortunately, there was a hang-up. There were heat sinks and part of the battery monitoring system, the BMS, attached to the outside of the battery packs. And because of that, they wouldn't fit into the battery box that I had built. So as soon as I realized that was a problem, I contacted Electric Yacht. He understood at that point that I didn't know that much about electricity, and I didn't want to screw up a system that was so valuable. And so he actually sent a technician across to California from Arizona to help me to change that over, because he accepted, although we talked at length about my battery box, and I based my battery box on the measurements he had supplied. The 1.5 inch on the backside of each battery box wasn't included in those measurements. And so overall, I had a 3-inch problem in my battery box. He actually sent Jim over, and Jim spent a day or two with me, and he rewired those BMS systems onto a heatsink plate that was also inside my engine box. So the size of my diesel would completely fill the engine box. Once the electric motors were installed in my in the boat, it was remarkable the amount of space that I had. It was all very easy. So as soon as the electric motors were in, the batteries were in, it was all wired and hooked up. I had no reason not to splash the boat, so I did. This is when range anxiety became my first issue. I was on the hard in Napa Marina, which is about 28 miles up the Napa River from Vallejo. And the marina I had booked was just outside the Vallejo River on the Cardenas Straits, in the delta in San Francisco. And it was 28 miles I had to go under electric power as my first trip. Now, my electric yacht system was a 360 IBI dual electric motors strapped back to back, run off belts down to a cog system that reduced the gearing down to spin the prop shaft at technicals. Technical specs, every boat is completely different. Anyway, if I was to crank up the throttle full speed, I could have a 360 amp draw. Now, I knew I would never need that. The electric motor controller can be adjusted. There was a little dial on the side of it that I could wind that up or down to allow the throttle to produce the maximum output that I wanted, not the maximum output that was possible to do. Unfortunately, I was in a river, so I couldn't do speed trials. So I cranked it down to about 150 amp maximum. And I picked a high tide. Planning's always important. There's no point fighting against a tide. And I invited a few friends, and we drove silently down a river and did 28 miles the first trip without any problem whatsoever. Once we hit the Cardenas Strait, the tide had changed, and we did have a bit of a fight coming up through against the tide to get into the Glen Cove Marina. However, we made it. We got to the dock. We had a bit of a photo session. Another friend came out with a boat. We'd pulled up some sails down in the strait. We had a sail around, and we got into the dock, and the boat was pretty much empty. But that was planned. The batteries were... I'd always planned to run the batteries down. I was going to take to charge the batteries from flat. That was some information I really wanted. So we got to the dock. We had power to get into the dock. The batteries were running very low, and we plugged it into the dock, turned it on, and started watching it. Eventually got bored. The party kicked in, and by the time I came back later on in the night, they were full. We took it out the next day. We did some speed trials, and this is something that's very important when you do get your electric boat, is that you go out and you do speed trials for your boat. Find a distance, a 1 mile distance, a 2 mile distance, flat water, no current. Run your 2 miles at a certain amp draw, turn around, run it back again, compare the two. Wait till the tide changes, do it against the tide, do it with the tide. Do it all day long. Change the amp draw, see what speed you're getting from each amp draw, write it down, figure it out. I was very happy, about 125 amp draw, and I could get the boat up to 7 knots, which was my hull speed. I actually found that about 40 or 50 amp draw would get me going at about 4 knots, 4.5 knots, which for me was quite a good cruising speed, especially in inland waters where 5 knots is theoretically the maximum. As I later on went to Mexico and started cruising, I realized that 20 amp draw for me personally on my big full keel fat bottom girl was the most efficient speed. I was only going at about 2.5 to 3 knots, but I could get headway. And with a 20 amp draw, I could run my motors for 26 hours before I started having low battery problems. So 26 hours at 2.5 to 3 knots is close to 60 miles, 50 miles. So I figured on a regular run, I could have a 50-mile range on my boat without stressing too much. If I cranked it up to the 150 amp, I could get about 3 hours at 7 knots, gave me about a 21-mile range. Every boat is going to be different. Until you actually get your electric motors in, you get your boat in the water, there's no point me trying to tell you what your boat will do under electric power. I was personally thrilled with mine. It was amazing. Where are we? Hang on. Testing, leaving. Okay. So I did sea trials in San Francisco. I sailed down on the bay there for about 6 months. I had the boat out almost every day. San Francisco has a wicked current going. The wind changes regularly. And a few things I learned while I was doing that is that you can run out of battery power. If you're pushing against a strong current, if you're out having fun for the day and you don't keep your eyes on it, then it can actually run down quite low. Range anxiety again. I solved this. I originally had no intention of putting a generator on board the boat, and I resisted it for as long as I possibly could. Unfortunately, one night we were out having a bit of a cruise. I didn't keep an eye on the tides. We'd been in no wind, so I was motoring around the bay all day. And then on the way back, I hit a current. And that current was too strong for me to go against with the amount of power I had left. So I had to start seriously considering what to do if that happened. The best solution I came up with, rather than put a diesel generator on the boat, because first of all, I had nowhere to put it. And second of all, one of the main reasons that I got rid of the diesel engine is because I didn't want diesel on the boat. I didn't want to have a stinky boat. I wanted to have a boat that was as clean as I possibly could. While I was at the boat show, I also bought myself a Torpedo electric outboard for the dinghy. But I'll be honest and say before I had the Torpedo, I also had a little 6 horsepower Tohatsu. And that was wrapped up nice and neat in the lazarette from the boat down under the back deck. And so I was actually carrying fuel on the boat. Because I was carrying fuel, I had 2 5-gallon fuel cans. I decided, okay, if I've got the 2 5-gallon fuel cans, I might as well put a little gas generator. So what I went for was the Honda 2000. In my own opinion, I'm not promoting any product, but there's few products in the world that are really, really well built and very hard to kill. And I have to say the Honda 2000 generator is the best little motor run device of any kind anywhere in the world. I can say that because I dragged one around on the front of my boat tied to the main mast for 4.5 years. It took green waves over the bow and got completely drenched I don't know how many times. And short of blowing a little bit of air on it or some WD-40, this thing pulled 2 or 3 pulls on the ripcord and it started every time. But the most important thing is it gave me 16 amps of good clean power that I could put straight into the batteries and then pull straight out of the batteries again into the electric motors. So in an emergency situation, I had a solid 15 or 16 amps that I could pull off the motor continuously for as long as the generator had gas in it. 16 amps for me gave me around a 2.5 knot speed, which was more than enough if I was stuck somewhere. So make your own decisions. I didn't want a stinky diesel. I didn't want the noise. I didn't want all the extra hassles with oil filters and oil changes and dirty fuel in places and extra fuel cans with extra different fuels. And I didn't want all the hassles. So I simply went with a good clean option, which was a Honda 2000 strapped 30 feet away from the cockpit up on the front of the boat. Also, I found when I was at anchorages, I could turn that on, go ashore, and I didn't make any more noise than the other boats that were sitting in the anchorage running one of those things to run their air conditioning. Most days, I wouldn't bother charging it when the anchorage was a little empty. then I would actually charge it. I didn't want to annoy anybody with the noise. I didn't want to be annoyed by the noise. And having the lithium-ion batteries allowed me to leave them run down after a passage and then charge them up at my pleasure, not charge them up immediately because I felt like I had to. Eventually, the boat was ready. I was ready, and it was packed. Before we go on to what happened next, because I'd removed 12 or 1,300 pounds by getting rid of the diesel and the fuel tank and all of the electric extra equipment that went in it, and I replaced it all with 700 pounds, I had about a 500 to 600 pound advantage of weight on my boat. And what this turned into was my waterline had dropped down about 1.5 inches. Now that may not seem like much, but on a big boat, an extra 1.5 inch waterline changes the whole characteristics of the boat. And the reason that became important was because I was going cruising. I did intend to stay out for extended period of times. I didn't have a land base to store equipment in, so everything I had to take with me. If you've been cruising or if you intend to go cruising, you take extra anchors, extra anchor chain, extra fuel cans, extra food, sometimes extra people, a whole bunch of extra toys so you're not bored when you get there. And most boats, what they find is they lose their waterline and they lose freeboard. They add weight to their boat, which makes their boat more difficult to sail, and changes the center of gravity, which changes the whole characteristics of the boat sailing. I was really lucky by getting rid of 500 pounds off the motor and the fuel tanks, meant that I could add 500 pounds of of food, toys, and people without changing the sail characteristics of my boat. I was completely thrilled. I took off to Mexico. I sailed down the coast of California from San Francisco Bay. I got down to Los Angeles area, and I stopped into wherever it is that Don Brams is with the electric yacht company. We'd been in touch by email, and I decided to stop in there, show him my boat. By this point, I'd figured out all the idiosyncrasies of driving an electric boat. And I have to tell you, the feeling of driving an electric boat is simply amazing. As an experienced skipper on diesel boats, it's the audible sound that's important. You rev the motor, vroom, and then you know you have the power to play with. But you also have the torque curve. And a diesel motor, you rev the motor and it's brum, 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 and it's not until it's high rev that you actually get the torque to turn the prop with any kind of power. With the electric motor, it's exactly the opposite. As soon as you hit the throttle, it doesn't matter how slow the prop is going, you've got 100% torque coming through that prop. It's not actually 100%, it's closer to like 95, 98%. It's kind of amazing. But you don't have the sound, so you can't judge how much power is going into the prop. You just have to know that there's a lot of power being transferred down the shaft and out the back of the boat. What this relates to is when I went into Dana Point Marina, I just pulled in on an end finger. I went into the office to get a guest slip for the night. They told me the guest slip was over here down this dock. And when I went and had a look, there was about a 60-foot gap between two big multi-million-dollar power cruisers. There was a gap from the seawall to the guest dock of about 50 feet, 55 feet. Rocks coming down from the seawall, multi-million-dollar boats on the other side. You drive down the middle, you pull in, you park. Unfortunately, then you got to reverse out. Reversing a sailboat, never easy, although you do get used to it. I had Don come down, visit the boat, and he had a couple of prospective customers with him. I invited them to come on while I moved down to the guest dock. We drove in down the finger to the guest dock. We got in between the two super yachts, and then in the space of the length of the boat, I could turn my boat completely around. One of the advantages of an electric boat is you can go from full forward to full back as quick as you can pull the lever. With a diesel, you need to go full forward, pull it back to neutral, wait a second, and then pull it back. With the electric motor and the full torque, you can jump your boat forwards and backwards, and it just depends how quickly you can spin the wheel as to how quick you can turn it around. And I could turn my 50-foot length overall, full keeled, fat bottom Formosa 41 on its own boat length with no space needed. As soon as I did this, I kept telling the guys, no, don't grab anything, don't fend me off, stand by with the fender if you like. But with the full torque coming out of the back of this boat, the performance characteristics were simply unbelievable. I really wish I could jump on my boat now and show you that, but I'm sure when you get it done, you'll figure it out for yourself. So just to reiterate, I'm not trying to sell anything. I'm absolutely not going to try and tell you you should or shouldn't have an electric boat. All I'm trying to do with this conversation is to let you know some of my experiences. Hopefully, based on that, you can have another perspective when it comes to making your decision about your boat. I did post on Facebook, and I do apologize. I hope some of you guys managed to find this video. I will, once it's finished and I get a link to it, I will post this video link on all the comments again. I had some technical difficulties figuring out how to get the live stream running from the preview that I had, but I'm not a techie, so I'm winging it. But I do want to get on to some of the questions you guys asked, and I'd like to thank you for the questions. The main point of this video is that when people hear that I had an electric boat, I get peppered with questions, and although I'm not specifically lazy, I hate the idea of continuously answering the same questions over and over. So hopefully this can be a record of what my answers are, and anyone in the future who's looking for an electric boat can hopefully find this video and their questions will also be answered. So on to the questions. Henry Koopmans, he asked me, good luck with your conversion. You're entering a new and up-and-coming field in the marine industry that could make you a lot of money if you perfect it. Well, Henry, thanks for the thoughts, but I'm not in the electric boat business. I'm just a happy customer who decided to be an early adopter in a cruising boat. And I'm sure there will be a lot of people that make a lot of money out of it, but unfortunately, I'm not one of them. Doug Hunter, he asked, what are my specs? Well, the specs for my boat, I've already said, it's a 41-foot boat, 32-foot waterline, 12-foot beam, 6-foot draft, 28,000 pounds. And I went from a 45-horsepower motor down to two 9-horsepower motors strapped back to back. So I had around 18 horsepower at my disposal. You lose about a half a horsepower. So I had about 17.5 horsepower. That's down from 45. I could still do my boat speed. I had all the power I ever wanted. And it was amazing. Theo Wakefield, he asks, he's wondering how much a new bank of batteries cost, the weight, how much weight did they add, how often did they need changing, and if you're interested in going electric because of your footprint on Earth, how to properly dispose of the batteries. Theo, some good points there. How much does a new bank of batteries cost? Well, how long's a piece of string? I went for a 540 amp hour battery bank. That was 6 boxes of 8 3.5 volt 180 amp hour batteries, and they cost me around $25,000. A lot of money. In hindsight, I could have done with 2 of those battery boxes, I would have been quite happy with 180 amp hours of usable power. But one thing that I'll continually harp on during the rest of this conversation is when you have an electric boat, you have to be prepared to sail your boat. While I was in Mexico cruising for 4.5 years, one thing I noticed was the number of horizontal sails I saw on cruising sailboats was kind of mind-boggling. And when I say horizontal sails, I'm talking about sun covers. I'm talking about sunshades, awnings. The weather in a place like Sea of Cortez, the wind fluctuates. In the morning, you've got some breeze. In the middle of the day, you got a lot of breeze. In the afternoon, it's a little bit of breeze or a big storm. And then at night, it's flat calm again. What I found was that I would sail. I sailed off anchor to anchor. I used the electric propulsion as a true auxiliary propulsion. I could use it to get into a marina. I could use it to get out of a marina. And the kicker is, when you have a diesel, it takes a few minutes to go down below, make sure your fuel's on, turn your fresh water, your seacocks on for the coolant. Then you need to come up and you need to turn it on. Then you need to let it idle for a few minutes and warm up, and then you've got usable power. You can shorten all of that. You can leave your fuel on. You can leave your water on. You can start your battery. You can start your motor, and you can hit the throttle, and you can go. But it's not real good for the motor. And if you forget one of those steps, once you hit the key, nothing's going to happen, or you're going to burn out your motor. With the electric motors, my motors were turned on the entire time. From when I left San Francisco for 4.5 years, I never once turned the key off. If the key was on, it didn't drain any power unless I hit the throttle. If the key was on and I was sailing, the regeneration would kick in as soon as I hit a certain speed. We'll get into that in a minute. But more importantly, if I found myself in any kind of a dodgy situation, if I saw an obstacle ahead, or if I had another boat coming on, or if I was about to do some kind of a sail change or an evolution with the sails, I always had the power at my fingertips to just hit the throttle, give myself enough power that I could control the boat and maneuver out of any situation that I found myself in that was a bit dodgy. How often do you need to change batteries? I don't know. I converted the boat in 2010. That's 10 years ago. The batteries are all still fine. They're not like a lead acid battery. They're not like a gel battery. They don't have a lifespan that's based on how much you use them. There's all kind of things that I've heard. I've heard you can do thousands of cycles with lithium-ion batteries. I've heard you can do tens of thousands of cycles. I've heard people say all kinds of things about lithium-ion batteries. And in my experience, I honestly don't know how long they're going to last. They're still running fine. They've lost a little bit of capacity, but just a few percentage points of capacity. How would you dispose of them? Well, like you dispose of any other battery, you go in to get new batteries, and the person supplying the batteries is generally the best person to dispose of old batteries. And if it's a reputable company, they'll dispose of the batteries in a responsible manner. So Mark C. Renland, he asked, what batteries do you use and how big? Like I've been saying, they were LiFePO4 batteries, lithium iron phosphate, blah, 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 lithium batteries. Actual size, they were 20 centimeters by 30 centimeters by 7 centimeters. And I had 6 times 8, whatever that works out to be, 48 of them. They each weighed about 6 or 7 pounds. I had 8 in a box, nice aluminum box, and altogether the battery box with the batteries and the heat sinks come in at about 100 pounds. If I did it again, like I said a few minutes ago, I would have only used 2 of those battery boxes. I think the less power you have, the less you rely on it, the less you rely on your motor, the better sailor you're going to become. As long as you have power to get out of a dangerous situation if you get yourself into it. Rob Armstrong, he asked, any concerns of increased fire from batteries? Rob, yeah, there's always concerns. There's always concerns with fuel leaks. There's always concerns with electrical faults in all your systems. The one thing I did kind of understand was that the increased chance of fire from lithium batteries doesn't come from the discharge or the use of them, but it comes from the charging of them. One of the advantages of lithium is they will take more of a charge more quickly. But with the application and the marine application, the dock power that you'll have access to is generally 30 amp or 50 amp, which restricts your battery charger to a 30 amp or a 50 amp battery charger. And the lithium ion batteries can take a much faster charge than that, much harder charge. So unless you've got some way to get 100 amps or 180 amps into your batteries in one shot, like a super fast Tesla charger, I don't really think that the lithium ion batteries are an increased fire risk on a marine application. Again, I'm no expert, but from what I've heard from companies like Tesla, any high impact on the batteries is what causes damage to the batteries. A car crash, for example, and the chances of having a car crash type impact on a battery bank that's inside a boat is very slim. So in my experience, the increased fire risk by having lithium ion batteries in a boat is negligible. Arno Crisples, he asked about range anxiety. Well, Arno, range anxieties, actually he asked 3 questions. Range anxiety, is there enough power when fighting a current? And 3, just running out of power, entering a channel, etc. Well, again, range anxiety. For thousands, well, hundreds, serious hundreds of years, humans have been sailing boats around the world. There's records beaten every day, high-speed sailing records, distance endurance records. In fact, no, I was on a sailboat. The range anxiety came from supplies, from freshwater supplies, from food supplies. If I went out to sea and I took a number of trips where I was planning to be gone 6-8 weeks, as soon as I left the marina, as soon as I left the anchorage, my sails were already up. I was a sailor. I was prepared to stay out there for as long as it took to sail where I was going. Enough power to fight a current? I had plenty of power to fight currents. Not only fighting currents, a couple of times in Bahia de Los Angeles, I was anchored close to a seawall. The Chubascos would hit in the afternoon. We'd get 40 or 50 knots of wind pushing me onshore. And once the anchor line stretched out, it would get me real close, like uncomfortably close to a big pile of rocks. There was a number of times where I could throttle up just a little bit to take the weight off my anchor winch. I could go forward. I was a solo sailor. I had a remote control, and so I could use the power on the button to haul the anchor with just enough power on the motor to take the weight off my anchor winch. I could haul my anchor up. I could run back to the back deck. I could hit the throttle up as hard as I like, and I had no problem pushing my big, fat, heavy boat against 50 knots of wind and the waves that was pushing to get me to a new, safer anchorage position. Would I do that in a storm out at sea? No. I'd drop sails, I'd reef sails, I'd put storm sails up, and I would sail at the most safe point of sail until the storm went away, just like any other sailboat. Running out of power entering a channel. I did that. I did that twice. Once in San Francisco, and then once when I was leaving San Francisco heading south, I stopped in Monterey, and my batteries went flat a mile from Monterey Marina entrance, and I was quite embarrassed because I really didn't understand the system. I had the electric Honda generator. It was on deck. It was running. And I didn't realize that I could take power out of the batteries at the same speed the generator was putting it in. And like a true newbie, I sat out there for 4 or 5 hours with just bobbing away with the generator running up front. And I was waiting for enough power to drive myself in the marina, when in reality, as soon as I pulled the cord on the Honda and power went in the batteries, I could have started taking it out immediately and motored slowly into the marina. But running out of power is like running out of diesel. You always keep something in the tank, so when you get back to shore, you've got enough to get into your slip. So with experience and knowledge of your system, you sail to the point where you need to drop sails, and then you have enough power to get to where you need to go. Breaking waves. They asked, do I use a diesel generator to extend your range, and what size? Like I say, I didn't use a diesel generator. I didn't want to have big noisy diesel down under the deck. I wanted silent running for as much as possible. But that's all personal choice. Each captain's going to have his own choice. My choice was to be silent. What size? Well, that's going to depend. I would suggest, before you decide what size generator you want, you put your electric motor and controller and batteries in, you go out and do your sea trials, and you figure out your speeds. When you determine what amp draw you need to get your boat to a certain speed, if you can match your generator to that amp draw, then once that generator is running, you will be able to run your boat at that speed for as long as the generator is running. Kind of logical. Olivia Kai asks, is a diesel generator needed? Because in Canada, we don't get as much sun to make solar work as efficiently. Olivia, I had no solar for my electric propulsion. I had 3 separate battery banks on board the boat. I had 2 8D gel solar batteries for my house bank. I had my 540 amp lithium bank for my propulsion. And it turned out that if I was to take a pair of 12 volt deep cycle heavy duty batteries and put them right up at the bow of my boat, then they would run my 48 volt anchor winch. I had 2 tiny little solar panels on a piece of plywood with a cable running out the front hatch that I could kick around the front deck, and that would trickle charge my my anchoring batteries to the point that there was once in 5 years that I had to actually recharge my anchoring bank off power source. And that was because I had a week of overcast weather and excuse me, a week of overcast weather, and I'd re-anchored the boat 10 or 15 times in that week. I had the solar on the cabin top on my Dodger. I had a hard Dodger built, and I had these super high-tech, really thin solar panels that you could walk on. I had those on my Dodger top. I used that to stand on to flake the mizzen sail when I dropped it, and they managed to keep up with my domestic power almost completely. And as for the solar for my propulsion bank, there was no solar. The reason for that is because the amount of solar I would have needed was excessive. I did have a 48-volt wind generator that I had put on the boat, but unfortunately, no matter how silent they say they are, that turned out to be kind of loud. And more importantly, when you go find an anchorage, you're looking for an anchorage out of the wind. So whenever I was in an anchorage and the wind generator would have been handy to recharge the propulsion bank, there was no wind. The only time that would have been running would have been when I was moving out at sea in the wind, and it was a hassle. So I took it off and got rid of it. The regeneration worked, but we'll get to that shortly. Okay, Valentine Stomp asks exactly that. What is the regeneration like? I was surprised. The boat actually made more noise. The engine, the propulsion system made more noise with the regeneration than it made with the propulsion. As soon as my boat hit 3.2 knots, I started getting regeneration, and I got 1.2 amps. Doesn't sound like much. Every time my boat jumped half a knot in speed, it also jumped half an amp in regeneration. So when I was cruising at 7 knots boat speed, I was putting out around 5.5 amps of regen. Again, doesn't sound like much, but when you're only using the propulsion to get off anchor and out of an anchorage or out of the marina and into the area where you can haul sails, you tend to not use much. The stinky boats all want to drive at 5 knots. They all want to go as quick as they can to get there. With the electric boat, I actually found I was happier maneuvering the boat at a lower speed because I had the torque on the engine just by pushing the prop, spinning the prop. Sorry, that shining bright light on my face. Because I had the torque from the motor, I found that I was more comfortable going at a slower speed and having that extra power there when I needed it, rather than driving at a higher speed everywhere I went. And it was never more than a mile from a marina to the end of the channel where I needed to sail. Quite often it's much less. So during that time, while I'm motoring from the marina or from the anchorage to where I can sail, I'm running around preparing the boat, and going a little bit slower gave me a little extra time as a single sailor to get the boat ready to sail. And so kicking the boat up to 7 knots boat speed and having 5.5 amps of regen, I could actually come back after a day's sail with fully charged battery banks. If I was out there sailing for 8 hours and I'm getting 4 or 5 amps regen, and I've only used 20 or 30 amps from the battery bank, I come back with a full tank of gas. It was kind of amazing. I got to be honest. It was really kind of amazing. John Elliott, he says he'd love to learn about management of the power available for cruising, the logistics of needing to motor for extended period of time. What's the average battery replacement time? Well, the battery replacement time we talked about, I didn't have to replace the batteries yet, so I'm not too worried about that. The power management, the logistics of needing to motor for extended periods of time. Again, I was sailing. I sailed everywhere. However, in the Sea of Cortez, at night, the sea flattens out, the wind stops, so there is no sailing. As a single sailor, one of the most difficult parts of being a single sailor is all those long, long, long days and nights at sea by yourself. When do you get to sleep? Because the electric motors were so efficient, what I found was that at night when the wind dropped and I had fluttering sails, I could drop my head sail, I could drop my main sail, and I could leave my mizzen sail up. The mizzen sail gave me great stability so the boat wasn't flopping side to side. I could then put the motors on 3 or 4 or 5 amp draw, that low, 5 amp draw. The prop was spinning 25 to 30 revolutions a minute, very slow, about the speed your motor in a diesel spins when it's just sitting there idling in neutral, just the natural spin of the boat. Only because it was 100% torque off every spin, I found that in flat calm with no wind, that was enough to push my boat forward between a knot and a knot and a half. That gave me headway, so I could hit my autopilot button. I could point my boat in a safe direction. I could go downstairs. When I say safe direction, I mean the most comfortable point of sail. I could go downstairs. I could eat. I could sleep. I could watch a movie. I could feel the motion of the boat. I could hear the mizzen sail out the back. And as soon as the wind picked up, the sail started working. The boat would heel over a little. I could come up, pull up extra sails and sail again. Because I'm only going a knot and a half speed, I could look on the radar and I could see that there was nothing in front of me for 10 or 20 miles. And I could feel confident that I could, if I fell asleep and I stayed asleep for 10 hours, I was not going to go more than 10 or 12 miles. It gave me, it was fantastic. It was so fantastic, I decided to put electric lights under the boat, LED lights, so that at night when I'm becalmed, I could switch the lights on. I could have a fishing rod on the side and the fish would come to the boat at night and I could select which fish I wanted for dinner. Now, if I did need to go for an extended period of time under motor, like I said earlier, 20 amps was about my sweet spot. I could get 3.5 knots from 20 amps. My batteries would last 26 hours at 20 amps. There's conversations about what if you go across an ocean and you hit the doldrums. What I actually worked out my power requirement was that if I did cross an ocean in this boat and then I did hit the doldrums, what would I do? You've got a couple of hundred miles of no wind. I figured that if you're in a diesel boat, you don't carry enough diesel to actually motor across the ocean anyway. You're flat out carrying enough diesel to motor the 200 miles across the doldrums. So most boats, they'll just sit there and wait for the wind to come up. It's hot, it's sticky, it's awful. So all I wanted was enough power in my battery bank that if I did ever get to the doldrums and hit the doldrums, I could nudge the boat forward in a knot and a half, and then I could hit the autopilot and have a little bit of breeze, and knot and a half of breeze in my face to keep me cool, and I could make headway and slowly make my way across. From flat with the Honda generators and a 30 amp, I think it was 30 amp or 25 amp battery charger, I could fully recharge my batteries in about 14 hours. So if I did hit the doldrums and I did motor across the doldrums, I could do it very slowly. It might take me 100 hours to do 100 miles. But at the end of the 100 miles, I can start sailing again. And then I've only got to sail for about 40 hours with the regen working, and I get a full tank gas again. If I ran out of power during the doldrums, I could hit the generator and the generator would power up the batteries and I could take off again when it was full. Again, speed is your enemy with electric power. The faster you go, the less power you've actually got. The slower you're prepared to go, the more consistently relaxed you're prepared to be, the more advantage you're going to have from electric power. Elliot Roberts, he asks, I'm curious on your take on full setup costs. that we can plan accordingly and aspire to go electric. What is the power to displacement? For example, I have a 42-foot waterline, 22 tons loaded. If you were to use me as an example, I'd be happy to tune in. I'd also consider doing a Zoom video chat instead of a scheduled time so we can ask follow-up questions live. Well, Elliot, I appreciate that, but I want this to be a permanent record so that anyone who goes electric or considers going electric can maybe find this video and see it. I didn't want to limit it to however many people might be interested today. The power to displacement, well, I had a 28,000-pound boat, and mine worked fine from 18 horsepower as opposed to the 45 horsepower that the diesel supposedly gave. As for your example, I don't even want to try to I don't want to. I'm not an electrical engineer. I would just suggest you go to the electric company, the electric boat company that you are most interested in getting the equipment from. They have electrical engineers that can take all of your information, put the numbers into a computer, and the number can spit out at the other end, tell you exactly what you're after. I'm only trying to tell you guys my experience on the electric boats and my take on my experience, and my experience is great. Craig Keating, he asked, what are you using as the motor? What's the range from battery power and how do you recharge? What's your speed? Well, the speed depends on the amp draw. The amp draw depends on how much batteries you have and the size of the controller that you have, what it can actually output. And like I said earlier, I could do 7 knots. I had about a 12-mile range at 7 knots. Didn't sound like much, but it would get me in from a day sailing, in and out from a day sail. I could drop it down to 20 amps, and I'd have a 24-hour at 20 amps at 3 knots. It's like a 50-mile range at 3 knots. And I could drop it down to about 1.5 knots, and I could do about 100 miles. So range depends on speed. Speed depends on how far you want to go. How far you want to go depends on how long you've got to go there. Seeing as we're all supposedly sailors watching this, I suggest that sailing is the key. This is electric auxiliary propulsion. The main propulsion is sail power. If you're not prepared to sail your boat, you want a motor everywhere, I suggest you buy a motorboat, not a sailboat. Don't want to judge anybody. Evie Hippolyto B says, definitely interested. Most in the how-to, the efficiency, and the cost. Well, the how-to is very simple. It's more simple to install an electric motor than it is to install a diesel motor. The efficiency, it's incredibly efficient. In 4 years sailing, I never had a single hiccup. While other boat skippers are sitting in remote anchorages talking about where they're going to get diesel from, they're all accumulating everybody's jerry cans so they could go to the gas station and fill up 10 5-gallon jerry cans, come back, fill their boat. Tomorrow somebody else would do it. They're talking about, do you have this filter? Do you have that seal? Do you have this oil? Do you have stuff to clean up afterwards? I'm sitting there, la, 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 butterflies and rainbows. I had a grease gun on my boat. I had 2 grease nipples that needed 3 squirts from a grease gun once a year each. That's the maintenance that I had to deal with. The cost, okay, we'll get into the cost. I spent $40,000 on my conversion. That was complete. That was the 540 amp lithium-ion batteries. That was the motors, the controllers, the wiring looms, paying for a hotel for the technician when he came to help me rewire it. That was the fiberglass battery box, the Lexan lid, the stainless steel rails in the bilge for the motor to mount on. It included the new prop. It included the prop shaft. It included cleaning the bilge, painting the bilge. I got 40 grand and I was done. It was about 20% more expensive than putting in a brand new reconditioned Perkins. About 10 grand more expensive than putting in a underpowered Beta, and it was about 15 to 20 grand cheaper than putting an oversized Cummins diesel in it. Greg Patterson, he asks, he's thinking about converting a 55-foot ketch, but he's starting with something smaller first. Greg, I applaud you. 55 foot's a big boat. When I was doing mine, a 41-foot boat was considered too big to do this. I had to wait a little while until the guys who knew how to build these systems would build me a system big enough for mine. This was 10 years ago, and I'm certain that they've got systems now that are big enough for a 55-foot boat. And I guess as to starting with something smaller first, look, I started looking for a 30-foot boat when I wanted to buy a boat. I ended up buying a boat that was 50-foot length overall. I never wanted to sit in an anchorage looking at bigger boats thinking, oh, I wish I had an extra 10 feet on my boat. So if you've got the money to start with a smaller boat and check it out first and then do your big boat, more power to you, brother. I went with the biggest boat I could afford to start with, and I was completely thrilled with it. George Coelho, he says, I need new engine. Well, George, that's the perfect time to start looking at electric. If you take away a massive battery bank like I had, and you just look at the motor and the controllers, I had 2 electric motors on a 40-foot boat up to about a 30-foot Catalina type boat with a fin keel, not a big full keel. They put 1 motor in. The controller's the same. The digital readout's the same. It doesn't need all the hardware to connect the 2 motors together. It's just 1 motor on the frame in your bilge, so you're getting out of it for about half the price I did. As for the batteries, you can put as small a battery pack as you like, just enough to get out of the slip, just enough to get back in the slip and then sail all day. If you go for a small diesel, you're going to pay a lot more than you'll pay for the minimum system you need to start off with electric. You can always add batteries later. Daniel P. Kalinowski, apologize if I pronounce the names wrong. Aloha, I converted our Pearson 424 ketch to a Thusa system 4 years ago, and our cruising is around the Hawaii Islands. Do you have any comments on changing to a lithium-ion battery system, and how are your batteries holding up? Daniel, dude, I'm jealous. I would love to be cruising around Hawaii. Like I said earlier, Thusa was actually my first choice, but after 6 months of trying to contact them, for some reason, they didn't contact me back, and so I went with electric yacht. I would suggest changing them to lithium batteries if you don't have them, just simply because you can run them down, you can leave them run down if you're not in a position to charge them up, and it won't do them any damage. And how are the batteries holding up? They're doing fine. Eric Crouch, he says, what's your choice of cruising speed? What's the regen when sailing at 7 to 8 knots? Does having an electric motor change the way you use the vessel? What made you choose the type of motor, and is it underpowered? Yes, it was underpowered, but the way I choose to use the boat, the underpower didn't matter. I never tried to sail into weather. I never decided that I've got 20 miles to go, I'm going to hit the throttles and go. If I still had 20 miles to go at sunset and the wind was dying, like I said earlier, I put minimum amp draw. I put myself in a safe direction. I have a nice evening out on the water, completely silent. Does it change the way I use the vessel? Yeah, it forced me to use the boat a whole lot more than a lot of people. I was out there a lot longer than some of them, but I don't regret any of it. They say the first day and the last day are the best days of a boat owner's life. I would completely disagree. It's every single minute I spent between those 2 days was completely magical to me. Mark Rickle says, what range do you have? What's the amp hours for said range? What's the regen from the prop? And is there a change in sail planning and weather window picking? Well, like I say, the range depends on your speed. I had about 100 miles range as the maximum. I had about, at slow speed, I had about a 12, 13 mile range at full speed. The amp hours, I went through that. The regen from the prop, I would suggest if you're going to go with electric, then you speak to the people who make the electric motors for you, and you speak to a prop designer, and you have a new prop built if it's in your budget, and you try and catch as much of that regen as you can. Is there a change in sail planning and weather window picking? Mark? No. The sail planning, I sail to be there until I get there. The weather window picking, I always pick a nice day to start. I was on a heavy, big, full draft, full displacement boat. So I had no problem leaving port in 20, 25 knots of wind. It gave me a hell of a nice day's sail to start with. I tried not to leave harbor when there was no wind, because then I knew I'd just get stuck out there running out of battery power. So for me, it was all about sailing. So I picked days where I could actually sail. One funny thing is a lot of people would ask me while on the radio heading towards an anchorage, what's your ETA? On my boat, we don't have an ETA. We have an EDA. It's an estimated day of arrival. Tuesday, I might pick, and then they'd say to me, what week are we talking about? Who knows? It depends on the weather. I knew I was on a boat big enough to handle pretty much any kind of sea conditions. I've sailed her in 45, 50 knots of wind. I grew up on boats. I'm not scared to be out there when it gets a bit nasty. If you have faith in your abilities on the boat and you have faith in the boat itself, then foul weather's all just a good story when you get to port later on. Andrew Hodgson, he asked, what are the realistic performance characteristics? Well, it's different from a diesel. You don't have the option to just turn it on, drive 7 knots and go. But realistically, the characteristics are you've got power whenever you need it instantaneously just by pushing that throttle forward at a second's notice, unlike with a diesel. In ideal conditions, what's your speed and range on a full charge? Like I've discussed, it was flat, calm, no wind, no weather, or a moderate kind of conditions. I could push the boat at 7 knots without any problem. The size battery bank I had, I could do that for about an hour and a half, 2 hours without any problem. I never did that, not a single time. In 5 years cruising Mexico, I not one time ever hit that gas and just drove to where I was going without stopping. I was very, very sparing when it came to using the motor. Nighttime, to keep me safe, to keep me heading in a straight line, and not quite true. In very light weather, I used the motor a lot. I got rid of the foresail furling sail, the head sail, and I put hank-on sails. I did that so that I could actually change sails depending on the conditions. I had a jib, I had a Genoa, I had a storm sail, and I also had a selection of spinnakers. I would take spinnakers from anyone, any size of boat. I had a little spinnaker off a 20-foot J boat. In 1 or 2 knots of wind, that spinnaker was fantastic. It would move my boat along nicely. In 3 to 5 knots of wind, I took a spinnaker from another Formosa. Someone had replaced theirs. I took a beat-up, worn-out spinnaker, and up to around 5 or 6 knots, this sail was amazing. I took a screecher from a 40-foot trimaran that I would use in light winds from about 5 to 10 knots. Much lighter sail than my Genoa. I was pushing a 28,000-pound boat in 1 or 2 knots of wind, I could sail at almost wind speed just by using 3 or 4, 5 amps of battery power with whatever sail plan I'd picked for the day. Most boats would pull the sails down until it got to 6 or 10 knots. They'd pull all the sails down, they'd turn their motor on, they'd drive at 7 knots, and until the wind really picked up, they never realized there was enough wind to sail. And most of them were not prepared to sail in light winds because their boat was only going at a few knots. I was exactly the opposite. I was happy in light winds. I could pull up light wind head sails. I could have my mizzen sail up. I'd leave the main down because it was just heavy and flopping around. A little bit of silent power, enough to keep the prop spinning and to stop the boat sticking in the water. And that was enough wind to push my boat along nicely. And some of my best days out there were in very light winds with just a little bit of motor power. So little motor power, your diesel would not be happy if you were driving it for so slow. Andrew Hodgson also says, I've operated several electric or hybrid boats and the reality never lives up to the hype. Unfortunately, owners tend to see theirs with rose-colored glasses or sugarcoat reality. I'd like to hear a good pragmatic assessment of the real-world performance characteristics. Andrew, forcing me to be honest. I really hope I have been honest so far. If you're looking for a motor that you can turn on and drive 7 knots and go 20 or 30 miles, drop the anchor, have a nice day, turn around and drive back, electric's not for you. If you're looking for a boat that you can take out to sea and sail like a sailboat and have enough electric power to get yourself out of trouble, to put yourself on a safe course while you do sail evolutions, changing sails, setting sails, whatever else you need to do. If you see another boat coming that's not giving way and you need to turn off and drive against the way that you'd be sailing, then electric's fantastic. If you're in a hurry to get somewhere, electric's not for you. If you're not prepared to sail, electric's not for you. If you love your boat and you love being out on the ocean for as long as you can possibly be there, electric is amazing. The fact that you can, on a flat, calm, clear day with no wind, you can motor along at a few knots, get some breeze in your face, go on a straight course with no brum, 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 no smoke blowing back on the boat because the wind's coming from behind just a little bit, enough to push the smoke back at you, then electric is fantastic. If you can imagine going along on flat, calm sea and seeing something a mile up ahead and it's just sitting there floating on the water and you want to go have a look, so you tap a little bit faster, you go creeping up on it and you find a raft of sea lions that are fast asleep and you cruise your 50-foot boat up to within a couple of feet of these animals and they don't even know you're there, then electric boats are fantastic. But if you've got a diesel boat, if you've got a stinky, noisy boat, you're going to go brum, brum, brum. You're going to head towards them. These animals will disappear before you get close enough to see them. So real-world characteristics are, if you're a sailor, electric is amazing. If you're a motorboat kind of guy, if you've got somewhere you need to be on a certain time, then electric, not so much for you. Arturus Svaldenis. Arturus asked, more specs, please. What boat, weight, kilowatt of electric motor, capacity of the batteries, and what's the horsepower of the old motor? Well, the specs on my boat don't really matter. Everyone's got a different kind of boat. And there's, like I said earlier, there's electric engineers at all of these supply companies that have computer programs and really big smart brains that can take all of the numbers from your boat and tell you exactly what you are looking for. As for my boat, like I said, 28,000 pound, full keel, 12 feet wide, 6 feet deep, 32 feet at the waterline, big heavy boat, 18 horsepower was more than enough for everything I needed. And I came down from 45 horsepower motor. Yuba J. Harrington Wallace says, I'm interested, been looking at Formosa and Tiana boats and was wanting to go full electric, spend time on the seawalls, generator, and regen motor. I honestly don't know anything about seawalls, generators, and the regen motors and all of that kind of thing. Sorry, Yuba, but you're on your own with that one. Oliver Barnicott, he asks, fascinating. I've been thinking about this, but can't find suitable, inexpensive motor. Most of the ones I've found are crazy money. I want a hybrid style option so I have enough power for 40 minutes or so from a day mooring to sails up and back, but with the option to power up if I'm in a fix. Well, Oliver, like I said earlier, a little Honda generator on the bow fixed all my power up if I'm in a fix kind of problems. And 40 minutes, is that 40 minutes from the anchor to the sailing grounds? Maybe you want to be at sailing grounds a bit closer to the anchorage. But also, the motor itself, the motor controllers and everything else is only a few grand. The batteries are your expensive part. So if you really can sail your boat, all you need is the power to get off the slip, out the channel to the sailing grounds. And if you're prepared to go slowly while you're setting up your sails, then you don't need a very big battery bank at all. And my biggest regret, again, I would have loved to have had the extra 20 grand by saving 2/3 of the money that I spent on batteries. Start small, add to them, because once you own them, it's hard to get rid of them again if you realize you don't need them. Max Hedgewald, he said, my big concern is range. We have minimal solar and no room for more. Well, Max, like I said, I didn't do it with any solar. I got rid of my wind generator after not using it, and the regen turned out to be enough. And the range, well, tell your boss you're going sailing, take him sailing one day and let him see that maybe you don't get back on time because you can't and you're out there sailing, and some things are more important than being on time, like sailing. So if you're not in a hurry and you know how to sail a boat, then electric's for you. David Interstellar Hard Drive Moore says, I've got a work in progress with a Fantasia 35, 22,000 pounds, just got 4 lithium batteries and figuring it out. Well done, David. I'm not sure what you mean by 4 lithium batteries, but it's exactly what I'm saying. Start small, figure it out, add to it as you can. Carlo Delano, he asks, DeLeo, I apologize. He says, has solar paint made it to the Chandlers yet? I've been reading about it for a while. I read about that for a while too, Carlo, and I don't know. West Marine. West Marine. Novo Lance Segi, he says, I'm interested in knots per hour you've achieved in your displacement weight ratio. Well, like I said, Nova, with 1/3 of the power available to me, 150 amp draw off a 360 amp draw possibility, I could do my boat speed at 7 knots. And my displacement, 28,000 pounds to an 18 horsepower boat, to an 18 horsepower motor system. So I was happy. Frank John says, interested, but timing might be too late as I'm tackling it now. 36-foot Hans Christian already have a 30 kilowatt motor and plan on a 5 kilowatt generator for extending the range with 1200 watt solar. Next job's figuring out the controller. Well, the controllers are available. I don't know who's going to give you one, but a variable speed controller for electric motors is pretty easy to find. And again, the plan on the 5 kilowatt generator, I'd get your boat out there and do your sea trials first, figure out what amp draw you need for the speed you want to achieve, and then base your decision on your generator off that. Chuck Fadley says, how does electric power affect your decisions on when and where to cruise? What do you do when a nasty storm front's coming and the nearest sheltered anchorage is 40 miles to weather? Well, Chuck, I was on a big heavy sailboat and a storm front, 40 miles to weather. Motoring 40 miles into it was never an option. The electric power affecting my decisions on when and where to cruise? No, the wind decided when and where I was going to cruise. And the nearest sheltered anchorage, 40 miles to weather. I was going from Cabo San Lucas up the coast about 40 miles to a little anchorage. And Christmas Day 2009, I believe it was, 2008 perhaps, no, 2009. And I left Cabo with 4 or 5 other boats. We all sailed for a bit. 1 or 2 overtook me under motor. Don't know why, because it was a beautiful day's sailing, but they seemed to have their sails down and under motor. 1 or 2 other boats were sailing along in company with us. And then the weather started to pick up. The day started to get a bit long. So all of them dropped their sails and motored to the anchorage. I didn't have that option. I spent the next 3 days, I kid you not, 3 days trying to get the last 15 miles. The wind was coming from exactly where the anchorage was. I would tack backwards and forwards all day long. I'd make headway, and then all of a sudden the wind would drop and I couldn't sail anymore. The current would pick up and it would just wash me back out the Sea of Cortez. That's the only time it ever happened like that. As it turned out, I arrived early Christmas morning. There was a number of boats that stayed in contact with me the whole time. They could see me coming and going for 3 days. And all I can say is I was really, really tired at the end of it, but I was really happy. One of the boats was having Christmas dinner. And as soon as I dropped anchor, somebody came over with their dinghy, picked me up, took me to the boat, and fed me a huge, big, fat Christmas dinner. And I was thrilled with that. John Mummery says, what's the cost? Where did your conversion kit come from? How long will the batteries last from full charge? What are the life expectancies? What's the size and area of the solar panels, wind generator, and weight? Well, I've covered all of that, John. The cost, all complete, from stripping the old motor, cleaning everything, putting everything in I needed, batteries, the whole lot, cost me 40 grand. But again, like nearly 30 of that was batteries, and I could have done with 2/3 less. So I think if you spent 20 grand, you'd have yourself a wicked system. And you can always add batteries. The battery's been going for 10 years. They're still going. What are the life expectancies? I'll let you know in 10 years. What's the size and area of the solar panels? Well, like I say, I didn't have solar for my propulsion bank. I used the regen from the prop when I was sailing, and the solar I had was just for the house bank. So that's all subjective on what your house bank was. And like I said, the wind generator, it's mostly any good when you're in an anchorage. When you're in an anchorage, you're trying to shelter from the wind. So in my opinion, a wind generator is a waste of space on a boat. And the weight, less than half of what I had with the diesel motor and the fuel tank and everything else. Chuck Pritchard asks, what size generator would be required to run it 24 hours a day? Again, Chuck, figure out what speed you want to do and get a generator to suit that speed. If you've got a 20 amp draw, you need a 20 amp generator. Ezra Graham, I always like it when we turn off the noisy diesel and can listen to the waves lapping on the bow, so electric propulsion drive would be nice. As a retired aeronautical engineer, many factors come to mind: effectiveness, efficiency, cost, weight, and the center of gravity, recharging, and the range. Well, I think I've answered all of those, Ezra, except for the fact that if you count in the effectiveness, the efficiency, the cost, the weight, the center of gravity, the recharging, and the range, all of those are canceled out. All the negatives in those are canceled out, in my opinion, when you take into account the silence. When I'm under power motoring my boat because there is no wind, and the noisiest thing on my boat is the dinghy towing along behind me, I was completely thrilled with the whole concept. Scotty Lee, was it worth the hassle? Would you do it again? Well, Scotty G, I'm sorry. Scotty, it was 100% worth the hassle. It was worth all the long, late nights that I spent out there sailing by myself. It was worth all the grief that I was given by other people who were laughing at me for being so slow when I'm on a motor. And would I do it again? I can promise you I will never own a stinky boat ever again. I am not under any time constraints when I get on my boat. I'm on my boat until I get back safely. I've never based my sailing decisions on a time frame. If I don't have time to go out, I don't go out. And honestly, I can never see myself on a stinky boat again that I'm the owner or the skipper of. Electric was the way to go for me. Gary Hodgecraft, we hope to follow a similar path. My question is, how to handle the naysayers who insist electric won't work. Electric won't provide enough range, it's too expensive, etc. I've tried presenting numbers, but to no avail, and it's an emotional reaction. Gary, we might have to bleep this one. Fuck them. You're the captain of your boat. Naysayers from another boat have no decision in your boat. It provided me with enough range. If you factor in the cost of the conversion and the fuel and the hassle to get fuel when you're in remote places, then the expense is negligible. I did 16,500 miles, nautical miles on my boat in 5 years after I converted it. I think I calculated I used about 150 gallons of fuel, and that was for my outboard motor on my dinghy, for my Honda generator on the deck. I didn't spend a dime on oil except a few quarts of oil for the outboard motor. No fuel filters, no oil changes, no dirty rags, no cleaning the bilge. The bilge was the cleanest part of my boat. So the cost, it's cheaper to go electric. The weight, it's less weight, so your boat's lighter, so you sail faster. The center of gravity, it's lower. And honestly, anyone who is a naysayer is someone who's never experienced it. So I kind of have a philosophy in life with everybody that if you haven't done it, you can't tell me it's no good. Anyone who's come out on my boat, any of the sticky boat captains from the cruising fleet in Mexico that come out on my boat, they were actually quite amazed. I did the Banderas Bay Regatta that Richard Spindler organized from Latitude 38 magazine. 3 days of sailing, 3 different sail races. And on one of those days, I actually beat him. Because I have electric power, I was prepared to take my boat places that people with diesel power wouldn't take their boat. Not because I'm brave, not because I'm stupid, but because the electric power is at your fingertips. You just have to push the throttle and you can drive out of a dangerous situation or away from an object that you don't want to hit. When you've got a diesel-powered boat, you need time to actually go and start that diesel and get it running before you can move. So simply by the fact that I had power at my fingertips, I could sail my boat in water that they wouldn't sail their boat anywhere near, because they know that if they get in trouble, they are screwed. Whereas I knew that if I got myself in a situation where I needed to drive out of it, I could just hit the throttle and I am driving away from the object. So don't listen to the naysayers. Paul Alcock. He says to me, did converting affect your boat insurance? Did your available power ever restrict where you could go? That is, were there marinas that were too far inland? Paul, marinas inland, I only had the one experience in Napa, and it was 20 miles up or 28 miles up a river. I got out the river fine. I consider myself a good skipper, so I left on an outgoing tide, so I surfed the tide out. If I found myself battling an incoming tide, I would have dropped the anchor and sat there waiting for the tide to change. Did converting affect your boat insurance? That's maybe the question that most pisses me off. The answer to that is I hate this part. No, it didn't affect the boat insurance. It doesn't take much research to realize that a good percentage of boat insurance has nothing to do with damaging your boat or damaging someone else's boat. A good percentage of your boat insurance, like 60, 70, 80% of the insurance you pay for your boat is for oil discharge. To protect you against the costs of carry a drop of diesel on my boat, the fact that I only had a quart of oil for the outboard meant that, in my opinion, my insurance should have been reduced exponentially. I didn't have insurance on my boat. I decided against it. I decided the $1,000 a year that they wanted me to pay for oil cleanup insurance when I didn't have oil on my boat was an expense I wasn't prepared to pay for. When I leave dock, I take full responsibility for everything I do on the boat. And so I made a personal choice to not bother with boat insurance. But I wouldn't recommend that. I was lucky I got away with it. I didn't have any insurance claims. I didn't have any damage to anybody else's boat. I had more power than I've ever had on a boat and more maneuverability than I've ever had on a boat before. I could drive my boat backwards with a full keel, full rudder, with the electric power. It didn't take much practice at all to realize that with the full torque available to me, I could jump it forward and turn it on a dime. I could twist it backwards. I was actually thrilled by the change in characteristics of a boat by having the electric power. And Daniel Willis, the final question for today, says, I'd love to have an electric propulsion boat, but not quite yet. Daniel, all I can say is don't wait too long, Bubba. Having an electric boat is absolutely amazing. Once you've been on one, if you have one down at the marina, take a box of beer down, ask for an invitation to go out, test it out. The first time you get behind the wheel and you hit that throttle and there is no vroom vroom, but there is a jerk as the boat lurches forward. It's quite an amazing feeling. I had stringers on my back deck that were supports for the deck that I found that if I stood with one foot on each of the stringers, I could feel a very slight vibration under my feet. And it didn't take long at all for that vibration under my feet to be what I would use to judge how much power I was putting out rather than hearing the brum brum of the engine. To wrap it up, I'd say electric boats are not for everyone. The most key thing in making your decision is deciding if you're prepared to sail your boat more than motor your boat. In my experience, the cruising yachts that I came across when I was down in the Sea of Cortez, most of the skippers that I come across, most of the people using their boat, electric would not be suitable for them because in all kinds of fabulous sailing conditions, they were actually motoring their boat. It was too much of a hassle to pull the sails up and sail the few miles to the anchorage they were going to. For me to actually prepare the boat in the morning before I took off, pull up my mizzen sail, have my head sail ready to go, haul up the anchor, pull up my head sail, run down the back and start maneuvering the boat under sail, knowing that I had the electric power there to get me out of trouble if I was in trouble. It made me such a much better sailor than I was before I started. I was already a very competent sailor, but now I have the confidence to sail my boat in and out of marinas, knowing that I have that torque and that power to get myself out of trouble. If you are the kind of person that needs to be somewhere on time, electric's not for you. If you're a purist, if you like to sail your boat wherever you go, if you like to be out there in all kinds of weather conditions, if you like to be there using your boat what it was designed for, and know that you have the power to get yourself out of a sticky situation, then I would strongly suggest go electric. It was the best decision I ever made for me on my boat. For technical specs, I recommend you contact the company that you would most like to deal with. They will always ask you for all the details of your boat, and most of them have done enough different kinds of boats that they have it on a list already to say what you've got. If you have the opportunity to go to a marina or to any place and find an electric sailboat, go and make friends with them. I knew I would never turn anybody away that wanted to come and talk about my boat. I would always invite them out to experience it. And there were very, very few people who came on my boat that didn't get off my boat with the same feeling most people have when they get in an electric car for the first time. It's a fantastic experience. But that's it for me today. I do apologize for the stream not being where it was meant to be. Technical problems. I'm a sailor, not a computer geek. I will post this in all of the websites where I posted looking for questions and notifying for it. I hope you do enjoy it. Please drop a comment below. If there's any further questions, then I will try and answer them in the comments at a later date. Anyone who wants to organize a Zoom chat with me so we can have a direct conversation, then I would be prepared to do that if it's possible. And guys, I'm just a budding YouTuber. I didn't do this for subscribers, but if you like this, if you found it informative, then please, down the bottom there, hit that subscribe button. Eventually it will help me out a lot. I don't make money from this channel. I don't see making money from this channel in the future, but I do like dropping videos, and I will try and get more sailing videos up in the near future. For all of you stuck at home during the COVID-19 crisis, stay safe out there. This thing's not going to go away, and heading out on the streets just going to keep it out there longer. So from me in Portugal, of all places, I'm wishing you full sails and calm seas, and thanks for watching.